I wanted to start off by talking about something that is often not discussed, I think, when it comes to sleep, and that's the issue of partners sleeping in the same bed.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking about this fairly recently, and I've talked about it, I think, in the book too. And I'm saying that, look, if you find it difficult to sleep with your partner, then, and if you can, find an alternative sleeping space, because it's no reflection upon your relationship. If your partner snores, for example, or the bed is too hot, or if they wriggle around a lot, find an alternative space. And in fact, it's not the end of a relationship. And so many people have come up and said, oh no, I couldn't possibly sleep in a separate bed. It marks the end of a marriage. It doesn't. It marks the beginning of a new, wonderful phase in your relationship, because you both get decent sleep. You don't resent somebody sort of jabbing you in the ribs because you're snoring or whatever. And you can have nice little rituals of getting together in the morning to have a cup of tea or whatever. So I don't see the problem at all. But there is that psychology that, it's you've got to sleep together. Don't agree with it.
Mm-hmm. If I think about the UK or the US, I would imagine that in these countries and cultures, there may be a bit of pushback.
Oh, yes.
And go, no, if you're in a couple, you sleep in the same bed.
Yeah.
But I imagine there's many cultures around the world where this is not the case.
That's true. And there's a whole spectrum. So I remember when I first went to Germany with my wife, and we were given this fantastic room, huge bed, but separate duvets, which is a really smart thing, because often the temperature ranges for couples will change. So separate duvets is a really easy solution to that. Snoring is, of course, a lot more problematic. But also in cultures like Japan, it's very frequent that the children sleep with the mother and the father sleeps separately. So there's every sort of relationship. And of course, the aristocrats, it was always, they always had separate bedrooms.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was chatting to one of my best mates about this recently, and he's a spinal surgeon on the south coast of England. And he said to me, mate, no way, that's the start of the end.
Yeah. If
you don't sleep in the same bed as your partner. That's how ingrained it is.
Yes.
But I guess let's look at the flip side. In our first conversation, we discussed together how poor sleep has so many impacts on our short-term and long-term health. And if we just think about the short-term, poor sleep leads to less compassion, less empathy,
reduced sense of humor.
Reduced sense of humor.
You need humor in a relationship.
Yeah, so by that logic, of course, if sleeping in the same bed is resulting in one or both parties not getting enough sleep, which means you have less empathy, less sense of humor, less tolerance to a whole host of different things, it kind of stands to reason, if you have the space, and of course not everyone does.
That's the issue. Yeah.
Right? If you have the space and the capability, it might actually improve your relationship.
That's how I would argue it. Absolutely, yes. Now, you have to be slightly careful, because what you want to make sure that your partner doesn't have obstructive sleep apnea. So this is where the musculature of the neck will collapse and block the airway. And so they'll be sort of snoring away, and then they'll just stop. And then they'll wake themselves up. The brain realizes it's been deprived of oxygen. And so the individual wakes up and splutters and snores and all the rest of it. And now that's serious. And that needs to be looked at by a GP. And there are easy ways to fix it. So, just make sure that your partner doesn't have obstructive sleep apnea.
So when you're giving us that warning, are you essentially saying, let's look after our partner? If you think there's an issue, before you move into the spare room, just have a look and at least ask the question, could this be sleep apnea? Is that what you're getting at?
Exactly, yes. And of course you can get apps which you can download and actually listen to your snoring pattern. And people have done that. And they're pretty accurate too. So yes, just be careful that it's not obstructive sleep apnea. Snoring is one issue. And of course, snoring can be enhanced by increased weight gain. Rather sadly, as we get older, we deposit more fat in the tongue. And so that can also restrict the airway. Alcohol, of course, will relax the musculature, and you're much more prone to snore if you've had too much alcohol.
Yeah, it's interesting. I spoke to the US physician, Dr. William Lee, last year on this podcast, and he's done a lot of research into food, but also visceral fats.
Mm-hmm.
And he said one of the first places we store visceral fat in the body is in the tongue.
I know, isn't it extraordinary? Who'd have thought it? Yeah. Mm.
So,
isn't it? It's bad enough getting old without having a fat tongue.
you mentioned snoring and you mentioned obstructive sleep apnea.
Yeah.
Just so we're bringing everyone along and no one's getting confused, they're different things, aren't they?
Yeah, they
can be overlapped.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. So snoring would be just the vibration of the tissues in the back of the throat.
Anything to be worried about snoring?
I don't know. I mean, if it's very loud, I'd sort of think about some corrective measures, such as making sure that you're not drinking too much, that you may want to sort of prop yourself up a bit. But broadly speaking, straight snoring is nothing to be particularly worried about. But obstructive sleep apnea is, because what you're doing is you're having periods of oxygen deprivation to the brain. And then when the brain wakes itself up, you're getting surges in blood pressure. And that can be very bad for the small vasculature in the eye, for example, and of course in the brain. So that really does need to be looked at. And so there's a correlation between our higher rates of obstructive sleep apnea and dementia, for example.
If someone is listening to this and they do snore, or their partner snores, and they're not sure, is this just a bit of mild snoring, or is this something more serious? What would you advise them to do?
Well, ideally, you go to your GP and they'll recommend you go to a clinic, and you'll spend a night, and then they'll look at you in some detail, and they'll monitor the breathing and the snoring and potentially the obstructive sleep apnea. But there are so few sleep clinics like that, it's tricky. And I mentioned that there are apps you can download. And so what I would recommend is talking to the GP, seeing what the options are. And if there's a waiting list of 2 years or whatever it is to get to the sleep clinic, ask specifically about what NHS recommends in terms of downloadable apps to monitor your snoring and potential sleep apnea.
Now, in our first conversation, Russell, I asked you what your views on sleep trackers were. And you were quite clear that there's very few uses you thought they were good for. You were sort of saying that, sure, for some people they might be okay, but you were saying that no sleep federation actually endorses the use of them. Yeah,
that's still the case.
So that's still the case.
Still the case, yeah. And so none, and also none are FDA approved at the moment.
Which means what? For an individual who's thinking, you know what, I see all these adverts for sleep trackers, maybe a ring or maybe a bracelet that I wear 24/7. Why should they be concerned, or why should they proceed with caution over the fact that you've just said they're not approved by the sleep federations?
Yeah, well. So, for example, you'll often read medically validated, and that can mean just about anything. And so, for example, what it often means, and excuse me for being cynical, is that it's been tested on 8 Californian undergraduates for a couple of nights in a sleep lab. If you're lucky, sometimes it's only 1 night in a sleep lab, and that's just not good enough. And also, because sleep is so dynamic, as we discussed last time, a single algorithm is simply not going to work across the variety of sleep patterns that we see, and as sleep changes as we age. Now, I'm down on them now, and as I said before, they can be useful in terms of telling you roughly what time you went to sleep and what time you woke up, and that can be, and if you woke up in the middle of the night. But anything more sophisticated than that, I would be very uneasy about. And indeed, there are now instances of people using these devices and getting sleep anxiety. It's now a recognized condition. Yeah. People get so worried about the sleep information they're getting from these apps, and they're in large measure inaccurate. So don't take them too seriously. However, what I think is on the horizon with AI is a much more interactive device, which means that it can pick up biometric signals, accurate biometric signals.
And what does that mean?
Well, it can tell, roughly what your breathing rate is, your pulse rate, and your activity accurately, and integrate that into a dynamic algorithm, which can say, yeah, I understand. I can tweak the algorithm that fits this sort of person's sleep habits. And so I think that they might, as time goes on, I would imagine in 10 years' time, they will be more useful, and they probably give a much greater accuracy for the sleep that we actually experience.
Yeah, I guess so. Like many things, it's early technology.
Yeah.
It's rapidly evolving.
Yeah.
And maybe in the future, they'll be a lot more accurate. It was really interesting. I don't think I shared this with you last time we spoke. In fact, I don't think I'd had the conversation at that point. Just over a year ago, I spoke to the Kenyan elite marathon runner, Eliud Kipchoge, who's the only marathon runner to have run under 2 hours, a marathon in under 2 hours, which is just staggering, basically.
Absolutely extraordinary.
And he does wear an Oura ring to track his sleep. And I asked him, on the morning of a big race, what happens? Do you look at it? What if your readiness score is low? He goes, I never look at it on the morning of a race. Because he knows that he doesn't sleep well, like all of us, the night before something big, or like many of us, I should say. And he knows for his optimal performance, in order to be confident, go into that race, perform at his best, he doesn't need to see a poor sleep score or a poor readiness score.
Absolutely. And I think that
which is quite telling.
Yeah, it is, absolutely. And of course, it's very interesting that we feel as though we need to be told by some inaccurate device how we feel. And we're in the best position to determine how we're feeling, whether we're firing all cylinders, where we're feeling, able to perform.
So what are the best questions that one can ask themselves to determine if their sleep is adequate or they're sleeping enough?
Oh, and that's straightforward. I suppose the first would be, do you feel that you can function optimally during the day? Are you firing on all cylinders? Do you rely on an alarm clock to wake you up in the morning, or a partner to wake you up in the morning if you're staying in the same bed? Do you feel tired and sleepy during the day? Critically, do you oversleep on free days at the weekend, for example?
And what does that mean?
Well, basically, normally, you've got to get up at a particular time during the week, and then you're sleeping in for 2 or 3 hours at the weekend, and that's telling you you're not getting enough sleep during the week, and so you need to go to bed earlier and get the sleep that you need. And it's worth bearing in mind that many people think, I can just completely catch up by oversleeping at the weekend. You can partially, but not fully. Some really interesting experiments have shown is you don't fully catch up after a weekend of oversleeping. You're still starting Monday with a sleep debt. So you've got to really get that stability. The other problem, of course, about oversleeping is that you're not getting the morning light, which is so important for setting the body clock and the sleep-wake cycle.
To make it really practical though, Russell, some people will say, I get what you're saying, but my life is tough in the week with my children, with my work demands. I just can't go to bed at a time that would be optimal. And I do need an alarm clock because my job is what feeds me and my family. In that situation, at the weekend, let's say on a conventional Monday to Friday job, is there a downside to sleeping in? And the second part to this question is, what about catch-up naps on a Saturday afternoon or a Sunday afternoon?
Yeah. Okay. So yes, it is difficult, but it's all about prioritizing. Because we can cut our sleep, we think that we can squeeze other sorts of activities into the time that we would normally sleep. So we've got to take our sleep seriously. And if we need 8 hours or 7 hours, we need to go to bed at a time that will deliver that duration of sleep that we need. So it is about prioritizing. Oversleeping, as we touched on, is you won't catch up fully, and you can delude yourself that you can, I can oversleep at the weekends, I'll be fine for Monday. The data suggests that that is not the case. It can certainly reduce the sleep debt, but not fully. The other key thing, of course, is you're not getting that morning light. You're not getting that important time giver to set the clock and the sleep-wake cycle accordingly. So, all of the data that we've got suggests that it's regularity, which is the key thing that we have to achieve for our sleep-wake cycle.
You mentioned morning light. I know we covered it in our first conversation, but for anyone who's not heard that, perhaps give us an overview. What is morning light? Why is it so important? And how much do we need?
Yeah. So we have this internal clock, which is fine-tuning our biology to the very demands of the 24-hour day.
And what is it? You say internal clock. Many of us picture a clock on our desk, right? So you know, when you say we have an internal clock, what does that look like?
Well, actually, there is a master clock within the brain, and it's called the suprachiasmatic nuclei. So essentially, you can think about where this is. As the optic nerves go into the brain and fuse, sitting above there is a small paired structure of about 50,000 cells. And each one of those cells is capable of generating an endogenous 24-hour rhythm. I mean, it's just extraordinary. And it's based upon a molecular feedback loop. So clock genes are turned on, they make their proteins. Those proteins then form a complex. They then go into the nucleus and turn off their own genes. The protein complex is then degraded, and then the whole thing can start again. And so it's a biological oscillation of about 24 hours. But it's not exactly 24 hours. And so it needs to be set to the real day. So the internal day needs to be aligned to the external day. And the most important thing for that, it's not the only thing, but the most important thing is light. Now, light does different things to the clock at different times. So morning light makes us get up earlier. It advances the clock. Evening light delays the clock, makes us get up later. Now, because most of us, 90% of us, have a body clock that is slightly longer than 24 hours, we, under constant conditions, would drift later and later and later. So what we need to be entrained to get that internal clock aligned to the external world is a daily nudge, an advance. That's why morning light is so important, because it gives us that advance, which is what we need on a daily basis. So interestingly, we did some studies on some students all over the world. And of course, students are notoriously late types, but we found that the later the chronotype, and I know we touched on chronotypes last time, the more evening light they got, which would delay the clock at the expense of morning light. So they were sleeping through, not getting the advancing morning light, but they're out in the late afternoon, early evening, getting the dusk light, which is delaying the clock even further. So when we see light, it's so important.
So we want to get light exposure, ideally natural light outside, as close to our wake-up time as possible.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now, couple of things to elaborate on there. We're recording this conversation in January in the UK.
Yeah.
So we're at the height of the British winter.
Yeah.
Which means it doesn't often, depends whether it's clouds in the sky or clear, but it can often be 8 a.m. until you're getting morning light.
Yeah. Well, it is at the moment about 8 a.m. Yeah.
So many children, many adults are having to get up, let's say at 6:30 a.m. to get ready for their day's activities.
Yeah.
So they get up at 6:30, let's say with an alarm clock, which may not be ideal, but maybe in reality what's happening for a lot of people. Your advice is you need to get morning light as soon as possible.
Yep.
Now, morning light may not be available from the outside until 90 minutes after that.
Yes.
In the summer, I get it. Easy. Everyone wants to go outside and get their feet on the grass if they haven't gone, or whatever it is, right?
Yes.
On the wet, damp conditions at the moment, people don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So what's your advice with respect to that? And also, what does indoor lighting do? And these kind of sad lamps, I guess, you know, what are they useful?
Well, they're certainly useful. And I think we could learn something from our Scandinavian cousins here. And so in Tromsø, which I visited, it's the most extraordinary place.
Where's Tromsø?
Tromsø, northern Norway. And it's in the Arctic Circle. And of course, it's dark for 2 months of the year. And what the families do there is that they will have a light box, and it's set to produce more than 2,000 lux. And we can talk about lux levels in a moment, for 30 minutes, so 2,000 plus lux, perhaps as high as 10,000 lux in some cases. And they have their breakfast in a room where there's artificial light, and they use that to set the clock to the external world. Of course, there's not much of a light-dark cycle, but of course they're stabilizing it in a sense for social reasons.
And have they done that on the basis of scientific experiments, or has it been something that they've figured out over time we need to do this
Yeah.
for our physical and mental well-being?
I think it's a bit of both. I mean, we've got good data showing that morning light is really important for stabilizing sleep-wake. And also, you mentioned seasonal affective disorder. The treatment, I mean, some data for SAD and light is really interesting. Many of us were very skeptical when this first emerged. Say, oh, well, you sit in front of a light box. What's the control? You sit in front of a light box and you don't turn the lights on. You can, you work out that it's not going to work. So is it just a placebo effect? And then a range of much more sophisticated experiments showed that it really was the light. And one fascinating study compared non-seasonal depression and light, and they compared placebo, Prozac, and 10,000 lux for 30 minutes in the morning, and light was more effective than placebo at 2 weeks. Prozac was only statistically significant at 8 weeks, and then light was more effective than Prozac. So light seems to be very powerful for both non-seasonal and seasonal depression.
This is a really interesting point, something I wanted to discuss with you today. This idea that light is medicine. This idea that light is a drug. But we, as a society, don't see light as a drug. We just think, well, we can expose ourselves to whatever light we want, whenever we want. Light is, separate to our lives. We get on with our lives. We do our work. We go on social media. We see our friends. We do whatever, but we don't give attention to light. But your trial that you just mentioned there, or certainly the trial you're citing, is really comparing light to a drug.
Yes, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
So in your view, should we consider light as powerful as drugs?
I think we absolutely can. I mean, and it would be naive not to think that, for the following reason. All life on Earth has evolved on a planet that rotates once every 24 hours. We're exposed to a light-dark cycle. The light-dark cycle has dominated our evolution and our biology. And because from the 1950s, we could produce cheap, affordable, efficient light, we've invaded the night, and we've thrown away this incredible part of our biology as a result. And it's fascinating that the humans are wonderful. I mean, we're remarkably arrogant. We think we can do whatever we want, whatever time we choose. I mean, it's part of the success story. But actually, we do it at some considerable cost. And I think it's about tuning in to those incredibly powerful biological drivers, environmental drivers of our biology.
You say it's part of our success story. And again, this is something I've been reflecting on recently on long walks, Russell. This idea that we say that humans are really evolved and look at what we've achieved with our skyscrapers and our phones and our technology. But you could also make the case that we have epidemic rates of chronic disease. We have epidemic rates of mental health dysfunction. And so I guess sometimes we need to challenge the narrative that this is a success story. Do you know what I mean? I know that's slightly controversial, and I'm not pushing back at what you're saying. I just think as a general point, it's worth considering that there are some cultures and some parts in the world where, yes, let's say they've got other issues to contend with, but their chronic disease rates are much lower. They don't have mental health dysfunction. Like a lot of hunter-gatherer tribes, yes, they may have threats from predators, and we regard our lives as better, many of us, which speaks to this arrogance that I think many modern humans have. But I think we could also make a case to go, well, is it necessarily better?
Well, I'm certainly arguing for a bit more humility. It's all about its understanding. And of course, what we haven't had is out there the education that allows us to make sensible decisions about our lives. And that's the thing that's changing. And I think people are thinking, hang on, I do need to reconnect a bit. I do need to get that balance. Into balance, and so it's all about education for me, and it's trying to have the information to make the best decisions about our lives, and so that we can embrace the extraordinary successes of our species, but also not get kicked in the teeth by them.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's possible to have the best of modern humanity if we just remember some of the kind of evolutionary principles, as it were. You know, if we can remember those and apply them in the context of the modern world, we can possibly have our cake and eat it.
But I mean, we can't do everything that we want to do at any time of the day. There's a balance. We've got to prioritize and we've got to structure our days so that we can achieve what we need to achieve, but also not at the expense of fundamental biology like sleep.
You mentioned that it was in the 1950s that we discovered ways to make light and you know, our use of light much more cheap and more accessible. Yeah. It kind of reminds me a little bit about what happened in the 1970s and 80s with food. We found ways to make energy-dense, calorie-rich, super tasty foods that we can't resist. Yeah. And now I think many of us are aware of this junk food problem that exists in society. You could kind of make the same case with light.
I think it's a good analogy.
We have a junk light problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. I mean, it's very interesting because there was a House of Lords Science and Technology Select Committee on the impact of light and noise pollution on human health, and particularly how it affects our sleep-wake cycle. And it was really interesting to see how Parliament is now beginning to take these sorts of issues seriously. And I urge people to go onto the website, House of Lords website, and look at the Select Committee report. It's really interesting.
Let's just go back to partners for a minute sleeping in separate beds. When you have spoken about this at live talks or in the media before, you know, what kind of comments have you had from people? Has there been a lot of pushback? Are some people saying, no, my husband and I have been doing this for 30 years and it's the best thing we ever did? Or are you mostly getting pushback against that idea? I'm
not getting pushback. In fact, what's happened is that a bunch of celebrities, you know, then came out saying, "Oh yeah, well, of course we sleep in separate beds," and actually, of course, endorsement by a celebrity means it's kind of okay to many people.
Forget an endorsement by you, who's been studying this.
And so I know it's been the reverse. I think actually people have felt, phew, I'm so relieved. I don't have to feel guilty about it any longer.
And I think initially, people probably push back because they think, yeah, but what about intimacy? But I don't think sleeping in the same bedroom equals intimacy.
No.
Because you could, let's say, I mean, it's not an extreme example at all. I think it's happening in many bedrooms around the world where you're in a double bed with your partner and each of you are on your own devices, right? You're physically in the same space, but mentally you could be tens of thousands of miles away. One of you is in your curated world of entertainment. The other one is in their curated world. So yeah, sure, you're in the same bed.
Yeah.
But is that intimacy?
No.
Well, no.
No, absolutely. And of course, you know, if you want to promote intimacy, you have to have empathy. You have to be responsive to the behavior of your partner. You have to have a sense of humor often. You have to enjoy other people, and you'll enjoy other people a lot more if you've had a good night of sleep.
So one option is separate rooms.
Yeah.
The other option, which you have touched on, which you first came across in Germany, is you're still in the same beds, but you have a separate duvet.
Yeah.
Are there any other options you can think of when it comes to couples potentially sort of dealing with this issue?
Yeah, I mean, of course, the default is earplugs. But a lot of people just can't cope with those to block out any snoring noise, for example. But temperature, I think, is also an important factor. Males and females have different temperature preferences on average. So men prefer a slightly lower temperature compared to females, compared to women. And what's the basis for that? Well, we don't fully know, but one argument is that men tend to be larger. Therefore, they have a reduced surface area to volume, so they're not going to lose heat as readily. Also, men tend to have more muscle than fat compared to women, and muscle is metabolically more active and they're therefore producing more heat. So that might be part of the difference and why, you know, the Germans have used separate duvets. But there are now mattresses which also take the heat away from the sleeper. And I think it started as a bit of a sort of a selling issue, but there are data suggesting that actually they do improve sleep. I mean, we should talk about temperature and the importance of temperature for sleep generally.
Yeah, let's see that. It's interesting as you say that. I spoke to a friend of mine yesterday, and I told them that you were coming back to the studio today. And she said to me, I don't know if this is a bit weird or not, but
okay,
my husband and I like different temperatures. He likes to sleep completely naked, and I've got loads and loads of clothes on, and the duvet's wrapped around me.
Yeah,
that works for us. So I thought I'd put it to you. That kind of speaks to what we're talking about, right? It's presumably there's a temperature regulation difference or a temperature preference difference between the two of them.
Yeah.
And the way they're managing that is via the clothes that they're wearing.
Fantastic. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Have you heard that from others?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. To make sure you are taking action after watching this video, I have created a free special guide to help you improve your sleep and reduce fatigue. Now, in my clinical experience, most people who are struggling to sleep are doing something unconsciously in their day-to-day life that is negatively impacting their ability to sleep at night. So in this free guide, I share with you 5 of my very top tips that I have seen transform the lives of many of my patients. So if you want to get hold of this guide, all you have to do is click on the link in the description box below.
And the sorts of things you can wear in bed. Some people just wear a t-shirt. I think night shirts are becoming are replacing pajamas in certain sectors. Maybe it's because I'm just dealing with an older demographic, but yes. And so I think it's finding as long as the material is cotton or linen and absorbent and comfortable, then I think there's lots of different options. Yeah.
At the end of our first conversation, Russell, you briefly touched on biphasic and polyphasic sleep.
Yeah.
I wonder if we could retouch on that. But then linked to that, I'm wondering, has any of your work studied tribes, hunter-gatherer tribes or, tribes in different parts of the world? How do they sleep? If there is a couple there, for example, a man and a woman, do they sleep in the same bed or are they in different places?
Yeah. Okay. We need to go back to a wonderful chap called Roger Airkirk. And he looked at the sleep habits of pre-industrial Europeans. From the writings, the diaries, and kept on finding references to a first and a second sleep. And so went through, and there were records that go way, way back to polyphasic sleep. So not sleep in a single consolidated 8 hours as we're all told we've got to have, but people would wake up, they'd interact, then they'd go back to sleep again. And this was common. This was just the norm. And then it seems that as we've developed a more industrial society and we've compressed our opportunity to sleep, the polyphasic sleep pattern is not as clearly pronounced as it was. In the pre-industrial societies, light was incredibly expensive. I mean, the cost of a candle in the 19th century was almost equivalent to a working man's daily wage. Wow. You couldn't afford, and also they were made of fat. And you couldn't afford to burn fat because, most people were food poor. And so so we would. So the sleep-wake cycle was dictated to a large extent by the natural light environment. So anyway, Roger's work then stimulated a chap called Tom Weir to do some experiments. And he got young people into the lab, exposed them to 12 hours of light, 12 hours of darkness. So, expanded the nighttime opportunity to sleep. And what he found was they became biphasic. So they then sort of would go to sleep. They'd be asleep for a few hours, wake up, and then they'd go back to sleep again. And so you see this also in societies now without electric light. So people have studied, to Renneberg, for example, societies in South America, and shown very nicely that sleep isn't a single consolidated block. And that's so important because we're told 8 hours, consolidated, this is the perfect sleep pattern. And when people wake up, they think, oh my God, never going to get back to sleep. I might as well start doing emails and drinking coffee. And of course, if you know that the biology is like it is. And so if you stay calm, you stay relaxed, you keep the lights low, your chances are you will go back to sleep.
So potentially we could make the case that a biphasic sleep pattern is the kind of natural human way to sleep. Can we say that?
Well, I think that's fair under those sorts of circumstances. So, for example, you would expect that biphasic, polyphasic sleep would be the dominant sleep type during the long nights of winter. I think perhaps at the time we get to the short nights in the summer, we might find that the sleep patterns will change. So I think it'll depend upon changing, light-dark signals. But yeah, it's perfectly normal to have biphasic or polyphasic sleep at certain times of the year, I would say.
And on that, something I've often felt, which kind of speaks to your work really, Russell, is that society has really lost its relationship with rhythm. Everything in nature, in life, operates with rhythms.
Absolutely. Whether it be a heartbeat, whether it be electrical activity, whether it be the sleep-wake cycle.
And even if we think about, let's say, a 7-day rhythm, and we think about the fact that certainly when I was a kid, supermarkets in the UK were closed on Sundays.
Oh, yes.
Now, what's really interesting, if we really reflect on that, and of course, many religions have a Sabbath or some sort of day of rest ingrained within them. Pre-internet, pre-supermarkets being open 7 days a week and having online shopping 7 days a week, you would naturally have rest on a seventh day.
Yeah.
Right? So we have a rhythm there. And I kind of feel modern society tries to make us feel that every day is the same. Now, I get that we want similar wake-up times and bedtimes to help us with our circadian rhythm, but you mentioned winter and summer. And for many years, it's felt quite natural to me that in the winter, let's say in a Northern Hemisphere country like the UK, where you do have short days in the winter, and it's not light till 8 a.m., it's dark at 4:30 p.m., and it's even more pronounced of that in places like Scandinavia, it kind of makes sense that you would spend longer in bed and potentially sleep more in December and January as compared to the light months of June and July.
Yeah.
What does the research say?
Well, studies have been done which suggesting that we do increase our sleep duration a little bit during the winter. It's not huge, but it does occur. Historically, I suspect it was very marked, but because we can manipulate our environment in terms of light and temperature, I think it's become less pronounced. But it certainly occurs in many people.
Yeah. So it's reasonable to think that your sleep need might be different in the winter than the summer.
Yeah, I think that's fair too, yes. We don't have huge amounts of studies underpinning that statement, but I think it's a perfectly reasonable assumption.
But then we could go to what you said before, which is we don't need fancy tech to tell us about our sleep. We need to ask ourselves some simple questions. And therefore, if in the winter and the summer, whatever your sleep amount is, if you're functioning well, if you have empathy, if no one's calling you moody, if you can concentrate all day, you may well be sleeping enough for you.
Exactly. And it's also worth bearing in mind, we're not unique. We are just like every other kind of mammal. And all mammals have some form of biphasic or polyphasic sleep. They don't sleep in a single block, and their sleep-wake patterns expand and contract over the seasons. So it's not surprising that we show those trends as well.
Temperature.
Right.
What's the relationship between temperature and sleep?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So if we start with the circadian changes in temperature, so we're told that temperature is about 37 degrees C. But actually, if we go to the early morning, 2, 4 o'clock in the morning, it's at its lowest point. And it might be as much as 1 degree below 37 degrees.
So this is our body temperature.
Our core body temperature, yeah. And then in anticipation of increased metabolic rate, increased activity, our temperature is driven by the clock to start rising. And it rises and rises throughout the day. And then about 6, 7 o'clock in the evening, it begins to decline to that low point in the early hours of the morning. Now, what's critical is that circadian-driven rhythm in temperature also impacts upon the sleep-wake cycle, because that evening drop in core body temperature seems to be a signal to initiate sleep. So part of the physiology of going to sleep involves a drop in core body temperature. And if you block that drop in core body temperature, it's much more difficult to go to sleep. So it's a really important part of our biology.
And this, of course, is why hot showers and hot baths can be helpful before bed.
I know this. It's ironic, isn't it? You think you've got to promote cooling, but you're doing it with a hot bath or warm bath. And the reason, of course, is that what the warming of the bath water does is to vasodilate, to expand the blood vessels in the hands and the arms and the legs and the feet, which means that blood is being shunted from the core, where it's hot, to the periphery, and that heat is being lost to the outside. So that's why a warm bath can actually promote going to sleep. Relaxing, of course, but also it's producing that helping produce that subtle drop in core body temperature.
And again, that makes sense if we think about our evolution. We were living on the equator, and presumably in the day it would be hot, and presumably at night the sun would go in, it would be dropping temperature, right? So we've evolved under those conditions. Yeah. And so I guess these modern temperature-controlled houses, again, I can speak about Britain because that's where I live, in the winter with heating on. I think a lot of people don't realize that having the heating on in the bedroom, there's a balance, of course, but you can make it too hot.
Oh, absolutely, yes. And there's some discussion about what's the optimum temperature for a bedroom. I suppose the consensus is about 18 degrees. Personally, I like it much cooler. I turn the heating off and sometimes even open the window, so I like it nice and cool. But a recent study showed that in elderly people, 65, 70 and older, that the optimum temperature for sleep was closer to 22 degrees.
That's quite a big change.
It's a big change, yes. And I have to say the data surprised me. So, everybody's different. You'll have to find, what works for you. But of course, it's not simply the temperature in the room. It's the sort of bedding you're using. And of course, whether it's an effective duvet with layers which are keeping you warm, or it's something much lighter and therefore you're going to lose heat. And certainly, if it's too cold, you're more likely to wake up. So you've got to get the balance right, again, as with everything. But ideally a slightly cooler bedroom temperature would be the best for promoting sleep.
You mentioned lux before, which of course is a unit of light. Could you expand on lux?
Yeah.
What exactly is it? And maybe give us some examples of the amount of lux we're often exposed to when we're either inside or outside.
Yeah. So lux is an old measure of environmental brightness. And it's essentially calibrated to give you a sense of brightness as it would appear to a human observer. So the response of the detector is not flat, meaning that it doesn't absorb all wavelengths equally. It actually has a bell-shaped response, which peaks in the sort of greeny part of the spectrum at 555 nanometers, which is where humans are maximally sensitive to their daylight vision. So lux comes in values. So if we think about the sort of a light that we'd see outside, so shortly after dawn, on a clear day, you would have about 10,000 lux. By noon, that could get to 100,000 lux, even in Britain. No, it's not.
And do we just measure it as a static measurement, or is it more if you are outside on a sunny day in July in the UK for 10 minutes, you get X amount of lux. Yeah. If you're there for 20 minutes, you get Y amount of lux. Is it like that?
Yeah. It's certainly additive. And of course, it's constantly fluctuating because of cloud cover and whether you're moving inside or under a tree or whatever. So, but if you just took your lux meter out and you pointed it skyward, you could get up to 100,000 lux on a bright sunny day. Most of the time, it's going to be something around 50, 60,000 lux. But as we go inside, this is where the big changes are occurring. So if you stand on a reasonable sunny day and you point the meter at the window, you could get between 3,000 lux and 1,000 lux. Walk 2 to 3 meters into the middle of the room, and it's dropped to maybe as little as 100 lux.
And why is that a problem?
Well,
or a potential problem?
Well, yeah. And of course, the sorts of levels of light you're seeing in the evening would be something like 90 lux. In most domestic settings.
Even with bright kitchen LED lights on?
It varies, of course, a lot. And kitchens now are very well illuminated. So that would be more. That would be 400, 500, maybe even 600 lux. So the sort of light you get from a Kindle, for example, on maximum setting would be 30 lux.
So very low.
So low, yeah. And so what does it all mean? Well, the circadian system requires relatively bright light over an extended period of time. And so there's a lot of controversy at the moment because sort of people have said, okay, well, in fact, domestic light setting, let's say 100 lux, will actually shift the clock, but you have to have 7.5 hours of light exposure to get any effects. So it's a good example of where intensity and duration are being titrated and integrated by the circadian system. However, other more recent studies have shown that actually those low levels of light, even for 7 hours or so, are completely abolished if you've seen relatively bright light during the day. So we said that dawn and dusk is sort of the most important times for shifting the clock, but the clock sensitivity is being gated by the sort of light exposure that you get during the day. So what these studies showed is that 500 lux or more during the day for 4 or 5 hours would actually abolish even subtle effects of dim light in the evening, which I think is really interesting.
Okay, let me just try and summarize that to check I've got it right. So you're initially saying that essentially that the lux you will expose your eye to outside dramatically outweighs anything you could get inside.
Broadly speaking, yeah.
Broadly speaking,
yeah.
Which is why getting outside, particularly in the morning, is so important to set the circadian rhythm.
Exactly. And unless you use a light box, which is in the 2 to 10,000 range.
Like you mentioned before in Northern Norway, what they're using.
Exactly.
Okay. Then you were saying there was some research, and I know you touched on this last time, I think it was the Harvard research, showing that actually light exposure in the evening will delay the clock, but it was 7 hours plus.
It was a longer, well, the particular experiment, individuals were exposed to a Kindle, brightest intensity, for 5 consecutive nights for 4 hours before bedtime. And that delayed sleep onset just statistically significantly by 10 minutes.
Okay.
So it had an effect, but it was a small effect. But what's so important is that the later studies showing that if you had reasonable levels of light during the day, abolished those small effects of reading a light-emitting ebook.
Yeah, and this is something I became aware of maybe 5-6 years ago. I was reading some research that indicated that if you get a lot of light exposure in the day, it mitigates and insulates you from some of the negative impacts of light at night. And you're saying more research is now supporting that.
Exactly, yes.
So if you work outdoor for whatever reason, or you're able to get out, for a 1 hour walk at lunchtime. I know many people in offices probably can't do that, but if you can walk to work, walk back from work, assuming it's light outside.
Yeah, get off the tube a bit earlier so you can extend that walk. Yeah.
It's cumulative. The more light exposure you get in the day, the more it insulates you from nighttime light exposure. That's, I think, very empowering because there is a lot of concern over nighttime light exposure. You also mentioned in our first conversation that light exposure in the evening may not delay the clock so much, but it increases alertness.
Yeah.
I really want to unpick that because a lot of people will report to me that when they're not looking at screens for, let's say, an hour before bed, and I've seen this in my own life, when I'm not, my sleep is much better.
Yeah.
I fall asleep quicker and I'm more rested when I wake up. Yet some of this research is saying it may not be to do with the clock.
That's right.
Can you help us understand that?
So, of course, light is critically important for regulating the circadian system, but light can have a direct alerting effect upon the brain. And so we're not it looks like lower levels of light can have an alerting effect that won't have such an effect upon the circadian system.
So it still could keep you up?
It could, yes, but it's not via shifting the clock. But it's very difficult to disentangle because of there's the light alerting effect. But if you're working on a computer screen and you're, let's say, doing social media and you're being energized by emails and you're doing all that sort of stuff, that will also have an alerting effect. So in fact, relatively low levels of light and other activities that have an alerting effect on the brain could act synergistically. So I think the rule of thumb would be ideally don't use devices for 30 minutes and maybe an hour before bedtime for two reasons. One, it could have an alerting effect upon the brain, but also because of the sorts of alerting effects that social media, emails and all that and just thinking does if you're sitting in front of a computer screen. And it's all part of the process of winding down. As we discussed last time, most people don't have a sleep problem. They have an anxiety or a sleep issue. And the more you can do to relax and wind down before that transition into sleep, the easier sleep will become.
You mentioned the Kindle, which seems to have a very limited effect on the clock. Mm-hmm. Might have an alerting effect, but limiting effects on the clock. What does TV do? And of course, there's a difference between the TVs of the 1980s and the big LED mega screens of today.
Interestingly, we don't have any really good studies on that.
That's incredible,
I know,
isn't it?
It's extraordinary. And a lot of it is extrapolation from other sorts of studies. So what would a television screen produce? Well, the old tellies were producing something again in the order of 50, 60, 70 lux, but then you're
further away.
The further away. And so actually the amount of light would be relatively low. What you're getting from a big LED screen, it's interesting. We should try our Lux apps that we've loaded onto our phones earlier today and see what the LED screens are.
Although I don't have one, unfortunately, so we can't do it.
Okay. But we don't have any really good studies. And it's I think it's a very interesting question. I think there's a great citizen science project there.
What about, your iPhone? Or let's broaden it out. Your smartphone or these modern laptops, which are really bright, have got very high contrast colors, which is often a selling point for these companies, right? Do we know what the Lux is doing there?
The problem that we have is that the circadian system's response to light depends upon the intensity, the duration, the color, the wavelength, your light history, how old you are. And we don't have a really clear model about how this is integrated.
So many patients tell me that life just feels like a blur because of the pressures that so many of us face. The busyness, the overwhelm, the endless to-do list. I've heard it time and time again. Why haven't things changed? Why can't I bring these healthy habits into my life and make them stick? I've been a medical doctor for over 2 decades, and I have to say one of the most transformative practices I have ever seen is the practice of journaling, because it breaks the loop. We have these unconscious patterns, these subconscious patterns running our lives. We don't realize how many anxieties and worries and concerns we have whirring around, and journaling is a very simple way to get the stuff out of your brain. You get it down onto paper and you see it. And that does something really, really powerful. When does the new diet that you were following fall by the wayside? When does the new healthy habits that you were sticking to start to fall off track? That's the self-awareness that journaling is going to give you. When people ask the right questions, they get the right answers, and those right answers allow them to change their life. Take up journaling today and watch your life start to change.
So recommendations have been sort of kind of come to, but they're based upon many lab-based experiments. So, for example, there was one suggestion is that you shouldn't see more than 40 lux, which is really dim, for 2 hours before you go to bed. Now, that's extracted from lab-based studies where people were not exposed to a natural light-dark cycle during the day, but kept in a lab under dim light and then exposed to dim light in the evening. Furthermore, it would have been on youngish people, and it looks like the clock of younger people is more sensitive than older people. And so I think we need to be really careful, because I don't think we should recommend elderly people should be wandering around in their homes under 40 lux. That the chances chances of tripping and falling under those levels of light, I think outweigh any potential benefit, particularly as the potential benefit isn't well founded in science.
You mentioned there that children, they are more sensitive to the effects of light.
It seems so, yes.
In the evening. Do we know the age category there?
Not really, no. I mean, usually what's happened is that teenagers have been compared to 65-year-olds and 65-year-olds.
So we think teenagers are more susceptible.
Yeah, and that might also be why the sleep-wake cycles are more easily disturbed, because they are more sensitive to light. So again, the key experiments need to be done.
So I want to come on to nighttime exposure in the evening. I'm very passionate about what's going on in schools at the moment. We'll get to that. But perhaps a way of getting into this part of the conversation is this paper that was published in October 2023 in Nature. It's called Day and Night Light Exposure Are Associated with Psychiatric Disorders, an objective light study in greater than 85,000 people. Now, can I just read a couple of lines from the abstract? Greater nighttime light exposure was associated with increased risk for major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, PTSD, psychosis, bipolar disorder, and self-harm behavior. Okay, so greater nighttime light exposure is associated with all of those things. And then it says, independent of nighttime light exposure, greater daytime light exposure was associated with reduced risk for major depressive disorder, PTSD, psychosis, and self-harm behavior, which speaks to some of the things you've just been mentioning. And one of the conclusion lines was, avoiding light at night and seeking light during the day may be a simple and effective non-pharmacological means of broadly improving mental health.
Yeah.
Now, that's really, really interesting. You know this paper very well. Perhaps you could comment on some of your thoughts about it.
Yeah, I mean, over a decade ago, we were talking about the influence of sleep and circadian rhythm disruption on mental health and mental illness. And you know, we showed that, led by Dan Freeman, a psychiatrist in Oxford, that if you could even partially stabilize the sleep-wake profile of individuals with insomnia and showing paranoia and hallucinatory experiences, partial stabilization of the sleep-wake profile using cognitive behavioral therapy, which of course is going to bed and getting up at the same time, eating at the same time, and of course that involves light exposure, would reduce paranoia and hallucinatory experiences. And so what this paper has gone on, I think, really very elegantly to show is that, yeah, a stable, robust light-dark cycle almost certainly improves circadian health and therefore sleep health and therefore mental health. So it's all part of the same package. And it's great. And I think this is another really important way of showing that the sleep-wake cycle is a therapeutic target for mental illness. We should just, use it much more effectively than we are at the moment.
Now, also on a personal level, in my capacity as a medical doctor, I have seen at least twice, actually more, but two very clear cases. One I've spoken about before on this podcast, one I haven't, where adolescents who were suicidal significantly improved their well-being. And I mean significantly, by reducing light exposure in the evening, right? One of them in particular, it was 2 hours before bed. I said, look, let's really try, get off everything.
Yes.
Phone off, laptop off. The difference in mental well-being was marked.
Yes. And studies have been, would support that.
And even what I've just read out there would kind of support that, where the increased nighttime light exposure was associated with, in this case, suicidal ideation, right? So really quite striking. And so I then think about the school system in this country. And before I go into it, when I was reading your book yesterday, on page 314, you say, it is perplexing that while there is raised awareness about the importance of sleep and the consequences of sleep disruption in the media, decision makers across all sectors of society have not done much about it. right? So obviously, this was published maybe a couple of years ago.
2002, yeah.
2022,
2022, yeah, sorry.
And so you would have written it probably in 2021, right?
Yeah.
So what's interesting to me, if I think about schools, and I'm very passionate about this because my kids are 13 and 11, and what I've noticed, not just in my children's schools, but when I talk to other parents, is that there has been, since COVID, where homeschooling came in and Google Classroom came in on a huge scale, now lots of schools are giving homework to their kids, sometimes quite a significant amount of homework, all on screens. Now, in medicine, I've always adopted the precautionary principle, which is when something new comes in, let's just be very cautious before we start introducing it. We've already mentioned that light could be considered as powerful as a drug. I've mentioned how I've seen 2 suicidal adolescents dramatically improve their mental well-being by reducing nighttime light exposure. So I have a concern with this widespread adoption of homework in the evenings on screens. And actually, Russell, there was a question from someone who heard our first conversation. They emailed my website to say, if you have Russell Foster on again, please can you ask them what I can do. This is a GCSE and A-level biology teacher. What can I do to help my children live and exist better in harmony with their circadian rhythm? So I think this is kind of related to this. Do you think we should be this blasé about widespread use of children being on screens doing homework in the evening, or do you think we should be a little bit more cautious?
I think we should absolutely be more cautious. It strikes me that the educational sector is what happened to the business sector, 20 years ago or more, which is you squeeze more and more and more into an overpacked day, and therefore you invade the night. And of course, the educational demands on our young people is extraordinary, pressurized by metrics of schools, and they've got to do well and all the rest of it. And I think at some degree that personal well-being is being sacrificed as a result. We should allow, the one thing we know about sleep is that it enhances our ability to not only memorize facts, but actually come up with innovative solutions to complex problems. And by packing masses and masses into the evening and reducing the opportunity to relax and sleep, we're actually impeding the one thing that we want to enhance, which is our ability of our brains to function.
Yeah.
And I don't think that message has got clearly into the educational sector.
And I really feel passionately about this. And look, I'm not a teacher, right? So I want to reiterate what I always say, which is I really have so much respect for teachers.
Absolutely.
I'm sure, like all professions, they're trying to do the best that they can.
Absolutely.
But sometimes what happens is that you just get swept in the tide of what's happening around you. And often you find no one's actually given this any thought. And I actually would like to start maybe a national campaign on this in some way to go, listen, guys, let's just be cautious. Sure, technology is coming into the workplace. You may feel that it's important to teach kids about technology. Okay, maybe do that in the day. Maybe do that in the mornings at school. Let's not get our kids having loads of light exposure in the evenings, because also, Russell, what happens, and I give talks at schools. So often when I go and present all this research, a lot of it your research, I present the guidelines from these organizations. And then they contact me afterwards or send me DMs on Instagram and they say, Dr. Chachi, I get all that, but the school is making it impossible because Johnny goes to football practice after school. School's half an hour away. By the time he comes back and has had dinner, he's going to be on his screen all the way until bedtime, or he can't get his homework done. I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but I actually think we could be setting off a ticking time bomb here. I'm biased because I've seen 2 suicidal patients in the past in this teenage adolescent age group. And I really would love schools to go, okay, look, I get it. We're bringing in technology, but what do we want from our kids? We want concentration, focus, empathy, problem solving. We want all those things. To get all those things, you need good quality sleep.
Yeah. And the duration of sleep, of course, in young people, I know I don't like averages, but it is certainly longer than the 8 hours that adults are recommended to have.
It's not possible in the school day. If you measure it out, I've done this with parents.
Yeah.
Actually, unless some schools change their approach to technology in the evening, I think it's impossible for some children to not be on their screens in the lead up to bedtime.
Yeah, we do need to think about ways in which we can mitigate some of these issues.
Yeah, look, every industry, and I guess we could call education an industry, although it doesn't sit that well with me, has got its own metrics, right? It's got its own levels. It's got its own performance metrics, which it is assessing.
Yeah.
Now, let's say that a teacher or a school thinks that, look, it's very important that our children are up to speed with technology because all the jobs require it. Okay, let's say that's the case they're making. Then we need the wider question, which is, okay, if the cost of meeting those metrics is that some of our children now suffer with severe mental health problems. And let me just read out that line again. Greater nighttime light exposure was associated with increased risk of all of these kind of psychiatric problems.
Including self-harm.
Including self-harm.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think it's a difficult answer, to me at least, and I'm a doctor, so I'm biased as well, which is, if the cost is poor mental health, well, I would say that price is too high to pay. So what I would love, and I'm going to try and do this with some schools, is actually have a really open discussion and go, okay, what are your challenges? What are you trying to do? How can we mitigate this? Maybe it's we give the homework on screens, but we also give guidance and say, listen, guys, do what you can, but really 60, 90 minutes before bed, we'd encourage you to reduce it. Or when you're doing this, turn the light down on your screens, or give an option, because if you are a proactive family who want to reduce light exposure in the evening for an alertness standpoint and a circadian clock standpoint, well, you're kind of taking the option away from me by giving my children homework on their screens.
Yeah. When should be the cutoff? And I think the debate has to involve an engagement with the students, with the teachers, and of course the parents. So a few years ago, we developed some educational materials for schools. And part of that was a leaflet, which was sort of trying to give guidelines for parents about how they should prioritize sleep.
And what was on that leaflet?
Oh, it was basically, trying to restrict social media use, regular bedtimes. One of the things that emerged rather chillingly from that discussion is that we asked these are early teens, do you share your sleeping space? Do you share your bedroom with anybody else? What we didn't ask is, do you have a bed? And what emerged from this group, who were socioeconomically deprived, was that a chunk of them didn't have a bed. They didn't have a bedroom, of course, and their sleep consisted of trying to sleep on the family sofa while the family were watching TV. So I think this raises a very important point in the educational sector, because these kids were then going to school the next day, chronically sleep deprived. They can't then take advantage of their educational opportunities and are already being socially marginalized because they're being deprived of a decent education, because they're being deprived of a good night of sleep at night. And I think that's so. Poor sleep is the hallmark of poverty, I think, in many sectors, but not least our young people. And we see, as we've discussed, the spectrum from terrible sleep because there's no bedroom, there's no bed, to essentially over stimulating, over pressurizing our young people to get the grades. And as I say, I think the analogy with the business sector 20, 30 years ago is squeezing more and more and more into an already overpacked day, overpacked syllabus. And maybe the debate should be, okay, let's step back. What do we really want to prioritize, and when do we want to prioritize it? And the problem is, they say, oh, well, the easy thing is you cut out music, or you cut out, non-maths, non-English, non-science. And that also I find offensive, because we live in a glorious civilization which has contributed to every human endeavour. And whilst I clearly see the value of the sciences and maths and English, we can't ignore those other things. So it's a really difficult discussion. I don't know how we do it, but it's a debate that we really need to have.
I guess business deals with adults. Why I'm so passionate about this is because it's about children. And children are more sensitive to light. The mental health rates in children. I mean, you cover it in your book, that I think it was US research you quoted that the increasing rates of mental health dysfunction in adolescents in US, it has been shown to be a cause of great concern. I know when I'm at my son's bus stop in the morning, most kids are yawning, right? Again, you can yawn for a variety of reasons, but we know that sleep is going down. I think also something for schools to consider is that for many kids, their downtime these days is on screens as well, whether it be on an Xbox, a PlayStation. So therefore, if light exposure is cumulative and the more you have off it, the more impact it may have on your clock, it's going to have an impact on your alertness, but it may also push your clock back. It's like, well, should schools, of course, parents have to do parents have to do what they feel is right for their children. But at the same time, I kind of feel homework going into screens is just increasing that accumulation of light exposure at a time when our biology actually doesn't want it.
Yes. Well, somewhat tangentially, of course, there's some very interesting studies emerging, particularly from Asian countries like Singapore, which has shown that myopia, short-sightedness, is hugely on the rise. And now there's a very clear correlation between levels of outside light exposure and the incidence of myopia. And these children in particular don't see much natural light. The pressure that's on them to succeed means that they're inside working on their television, they're inside working on their computer screens, essentially every free moment. And so there are other consequences than just circadian rhythm disruption.
I read some research suggesting there was a correlation between if you get under 2 hours of natural light exposure a day, your risk of myopia goes up significantly. Is that?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
I was at a meeting just recently, a talk just recently, and some fascinating studies. This is a real tension in Australia because, you need to get the kids outside into the light. But of course, in Australia and in New Zealand, where the ozone layer, is somewhat depleted, particularly in the south, there's greater incidence of ultraviolet light and the risk of skin cancer. And one of these studies showed that the lower rates of myopia were noted in individuals with skin cancer.
Wow.
So get the kids outside, but make sure that they're suitably protected with hats and sunscreen.
Let's play devil's advocate for a minute. What if someone's hearing that and going, okay, so the downside of not having enough natural light exposure, or one of the downsides is myopia, short-sightedness. So my kid has to wear glasses. So what?
Yeah, I suppose. So what?
I'm not saying that. I'm just putting it there. Like, why is that a problem? I mean, look, as someone who's worn glasses and contact lenses their whole life, I really wish I didn't have to. Let's put it like that.
Well, I think it's suggesting that our biology has evolved to actually need suitable light exposure, natural light exposure. And so what those data, what those observations are showing us is that we're not getting the light that we need. That's impacting upon eye health at some level. Yeah. And of course, these changes in one's ability to focus can have other sorts of effect. So, for example, retinal detachment and other implications. So I don't think it's just a matter of wearing glasses, but it's other stuff as well. And things that we're probably really just becoming aware of. So it's probably more of a shot across the bow saying, hang on, team.
Yeah.
Let's just step back and think about what we're doing here. Because this parameter's been affected, chances are other parameters will be too.
To finish off the children's part of this discussion, in terms of teachers who are thinking about practical things they can maybe introduce straight away, I imagine one conclusion from what you're saying is that encouraging your kids to get outside during the day, at lunchtime, at break.
Yes.
Not keeping, in inverted commas, naughty kids inside as a punishment.
To make them naughtier.
To make them naughtier. It might be counterproductive.
Yes.
Maybe, because I know in a lot of secondary schools, a lot of high schools, because I know this from chatting to a lot of these children, that there's such a pressure of homework that at lunchtime they go to the library so that they get ahead.
Yes.
And then what's that doing? It's eroding.
I know.
It's eroding light exposure in the day.
Yeah.
So I guess schools could immediately start to go, okay, we need to, at least in assemblies, we need across all the lessons, be encouraging our kids. Even if schools start to educate their kids, say, we're giving you all this stuff, but look, get outside in the day, get outside at lunchtime. Even that may make a difference.
And have a cutoff of computer use in the evenings.
Yeah.
And you need to wind down 2 hours before your bedtime.
Okay.
And whatever that is, and maybe that's the time that you could listen to some music that you love, you could read the novels that you love, or whatever it takes, whatever young people like to do before they go to sleep. I'm too old to remember. But it's not about squeezing more and more and more into this overpacked day. It's about stepping back. It's about, embracing the broader values of life.
The teacher who wrote into me also wanted to know what your chronotype is. Are you happy to share it?
Yeah, I of course, chronotype changes as you age, but I was a very late chronotype.
So you like to lie in the mornings?
I would go to bed late and get up late where at all possible. As you age, of course, you get up earlier. So it's quite noticeable. I mean, I this week I've had to get up early twice. And if I'd have had to have done that even 10 years ago, I feel utterly wretched. But I'm by default a later chronotype. And did struggle a bit when I was younger. But now it's become easier. So that's something for late chronotypes to look forward to as you age, along with a fat tongue.
Wonderful.
Yeah, you get an earlier chronotype.
Let's move on to sleep aids. Okay, so let's talk about sleeping pills. Let's talk about magnesium. Let's talk about melatonin. These are things that people commonly use either by themselves or they're prescribed by their doctor. What's your take on them?
If we look at the biology, first of all, then these sleep aids, largely speaking, hit the GABA system. So GABA-aminobutyric acid, it's a neurotransmitter which acts to inhibit the actions of the central nervous system. So we've got all of these excitatory neurotransmitters which increase alertness, increase the stress axis and all the rest of it. And what GABA does is turn that down.
So you mentioned the word neurotransmitter. For anyone who doesn't understand that, can you just put that in layman's terms?
So we have neurons and they talk to each other via synapses, and chemical synapses involve the release of a neurotransmitter at those junctions, which then stimulate the next neuron down the chain.
So chemicals in the brain to send messages between nerve cells.
Yeah.
And GABA is one example. Can you give us examples of others?
And GABA is one of the ones which actually reduces that transmission. So it
calms things down.
It calms things down, yeah. And so, for example, the benzodiazepines, Valium, or the Z drugs, Zopiclone, they actually act by promoting increasing the sensitivity of the GABA systems, which means that you're sort of turned down. So you're reducing excitatory neurotransmitter release.
Okay, so GABA is a calming neurotransmitter. What are examples of neurotransmitters that do the opposite, that excite us?
Just about everything else. I mean, so yeah, the elements of the sympathetic nervous system.
So adrenaline, cortisol.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. So they would be all excitatory.
Okay.
And of course, we have those projections from the hindbrain called the excitatory arousal system, which is this whole system that is bathing the cortex, that bit of the brain for consciousness, in excitatory neurotransmitters.
Okay, so GABA calms things down. So if we can enhance GABA, we can help to switch things off in the brain, which in theory is going to help promote sleep.
So sedation is not the same as sleep. So although it's working on a similar pathway, so sleep does involve an increase in the GABA systems and a winding down of the excitatory systems, but it's a whole bunch of other stuff as well. And you can think of benzos and Z drugs as being a hammer hitting the conscious centers of the brain. So you're not providing a complete biological mimic for sleep. And in fact, some of these drugs can, benzos in particular, can actually reduce memory consolidation and the formation of new ideas in response to complex sort of questions.
Wow.
So of course the sedative that we've used since time immemorial is alcohol. So one of the reasons people love alcohol is because it has a calming effect. And so you think, great, that's fantastic. But of course, alcohol, when it's broken down, produces a whole bunch of sort of aldehydes. And of course, they're extremely toxic. And of course, that's associated with all the metabolic failure that you get associated with excessive alcohol consumption. So people have developed a sort of mimics of alcohol, which give you the GABA effects, the calming effects, but it's not converted into some of these acetaldehydes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so in terms of prescription medications, you mentioned benzos and Z drugs. So some people may know, examples like temazepam or zopiclone. These are things that are commonly prescribed by physicians to help their patients sleep.
Yeah, and short-term use, of course, as you'll know, can be very useful.
Okay, let's say someone's listening to this and they take zopiclone each night and it helps them nod off, whatever that means. If you were to put them in a sleep lab, right, and you were to compare what goes on in their brain when they've taken a pharmaceutical like zopiclone compared to when they've fallen asleep naturally without that, would you see a difference?
You would see a difference, yes. Not a huge difference, but you would see a difference. The problem is that our metrics of sleep using EEG are pretty crude. I mean, you think about it. It's a cumulative changes in the brain's electrical activity. Frankly, it's extraordinary that we can identify any different states of non-REM 1, 2, 3 and REM sleep. So you will see some subtle differences, but not huge differences. But the use of these drugs is correlated with deficits in cognitive performance the following day.
And long-term use has an increased risk of dementia, right?
Absolutely. And in fact, in individuals with dementia, it's not recommended that these drugs are used because it causes excessive daytime sleepiness, and that can be a real problem as well. So I think my position would be, and I'm not a clinician, but on the basis of the papers that I've read, short-term use, yes, that's fine. Let's say a week or so to correct, let's say, a really difficult time. Let's say you're struggling with emotional issues. There's been some bereavement in the family. Then you might want to just have a short-term correct. But then either ease out or try and then use the cognitive behavioral therapies for sleep. Light exposure, winding down, all those sorts of things that we talked about last time. And that are in Lifetime.
Just to, stand up for clinicians for a moment, what often happens is the clinician's desire is to give it as a short-term tool.
Yes, that's my understanding too, yeah.
But then what you'll often see is a patient found it useful, and then 7 days later when they're there for their repeat consultation, it can be quite a difficult discussion because often, not always, of course, every situation is unique, but often the patient's like, well, listen, it was so good. It really helped me. I just want it for a bit more. And I think clinicians can, especially if the consultation is time limited.
Yes.
And I've been in many of these tricky consultations before where it's just really hard, and a patient can often feel hard done by if you don't re-prescribe it.
And then they become anxious and they don't sleep.
Yeah, so it is quite complex. Let's talk about magnesium. Magnesium is seen as a natural sleep aid. What happens?
Yeah, and the data are emerging which suggests that magnesium may indeed be useful as a sleep aid. It's still not absolutely solid, but there are some studies, some correlation studies, which have given additional magnesium, and there's been a statistical difference, a statistical improvement of sleep. And interestingly, magnesium is thought to act on those GABA receptors in enhancing GABA responsiveness. And of course, anything that reduces anxiety and produces more of a relaxed state can be useful in getting into sleep.
And magnesium, of course, many of us call it the relaxation mineral.
Yeah.
And so I have used it effectively with many, many patients when you get that sense from them that, everything's a bit tight, right? They're wound up, even the bowel is tight, right? They're constipated. All these things, you start to build up a picture. Oh, maybe magnesium might be helpful. And of course, I don't know if you're familiar with the research on different forms of magnesium or not.
Well, I know that depending upon the rates of absorbance so the formulation is quite important, as I understand.
For sure, because some work particularly well on the gut and can help with constipation. Yeah. Others are more helpful for sleep. But you're basically saying that, yes, the data seems to support that magnesium for some people can be useful.
I think that's a very fair statement, yes. And I have to say, I was suspicious to begin with, and then I looked at the published papers, and I became convinced that yes, I think it's an interesting avenue. So yes, I think magnesium could be very useful under certain circumstances. Yes.
Melatonin.
Oh dear. Yes.
So
here we go. All right. What is melatonin? Melatonin is this neurohormone produced from the pineal gland, which is a pea-sized structure right in the middle of the brain. Descartes said the pineal was the source of the soul. It was the seat of the soul because it's one of the only unpaired structures within the brain. Most bits of the brain have a twin, as it were.
What's your take on that? Is it the seat of the soul?
I think it would be fair to say that the pineal has no soul function. Oh, sorry about that. So
not just a scientist, a comedian as well, Russell.
So the circadian system and the light-dark cycle regulates via the sympathetic nervous system the release of melatonin from the pineal. And the release of melatonin is confined to the dark period of the light-dark cycle. So as dusk approaches, melatonin levels will rise. They'll peak at around about 4 o'clock in the morning on average, and then they'll decline in anticipation of dawn. So there's a circadian-driven rhythm in melatonin, and it's modified by the light-dark cycle directly. So if you turn the lights on in the middle of the night, you can acutely suppress melatonin as well.
Which is why it's problematic to do so. Let's say you're going to biphasic sleep, you're up at 3 a.m. Is that a problem to have bright light exposure?
Well, it'll increase alertness, but the alerting effects occur before you change the melatonin. So it is not the melatonin that is driving those changes in alertness. Okay. And so that's the biology of melatonin. Let's discuss its role where we know it's important. And so that's in seasonally breeding mammals. So as the day lengths expand and contract for a small mammal, let's say a hamster, then the increasing day lengths trigger the reproductive system and you trigger reproduction. And that's associated and is driven by a decreased profile of melatonin release. Now for sheep and deer and animals like that, they use the expanding night lengths during the autumn to trigger their reproduction because, of course, they have a long gestation, which means that they mate and then the offspring are produced the next spring when there's lots of new production. So the expanding and contracting melatonin profile is a beautiful reflection of the seasons, and that signal is used by seasonal mammals to regulate their reproduction and other processes as well. That's clear. That's beautiful biology, which has been well documented. What's it doing in humans? It's often called a sleep hormone. And it is most emphatically not a sleep hormone. So individuals who are on beta blockers, for example, produce very little melatonin. Individuals who are quadriplegic and have severed those connections from the brain into the pineal have poor sleep, but it's no worse than paraplegic individuals who have that pathway intact. So the evidence suggests that, yes, you can have a perfectly reasonable sleep-wake profile in the absence of melatonin. What melatonin does is probably have a mild modulatory effect. The most efficacious study showed that taking 3 milligrams of melatonin before bedtime could reduce the time it takes to get to sleep by around about 20 minutes or so. So yes, it can have a mild modulatory effect. It won't keep you asleep. So we shouldn't be thinking of it as a sleep home at all. It's a biological marker of the dark, and it's also probably enhancing the effects of light on the clock. So light comes in, sets the clock, then melatonin is produced at night, and it's reinforcing a light signal. And so it's also been used, for example, in jet lag. So there's some evidence that taking melatonin at local bedtime in the new time zone can speed up the rate at which you can lock on to the new time zone.
So it has an effect on the clock.
It's having an effect on the clock, and it also seems to be having an effect upon the sleep-wake systems, but a mild effect. One area of action, which is really interesting, and we go back to sleep, and we talked about that drop in core body temperature. One idea is that melatonin released at night is actually causing that vasodilation, that expansion of the blood vessels in the hands and the feet and the arms, and promoting that loss of heat. And so that may be one way that melatonin is making it easier to get off to sleep. But it's still, I mean, I'm fairly much persuaded by those data, but we do need a bit more. So a mild modulator of sleep, it is not a sleep hormone.
I've also heard melatonin has antioxidant effects.
Well, yes, it does, but it's no more effective than vitamin C. And so, 20 years ago, people were saying, the reason why children using night lights, we've seen a doubling of childhood leukemia since the 1950s, is because everybody's turning night lights on, and that's suppressing melatonin at night, and that's taking away an antioxidant and all that. Nonsense, absolute nonsense, because the level of light you get from a night light is too low to suppress melatonin.
Just to take a quick aside there from melatonin, children's night lights, many kids want to have a light on at night. In your view, should we be careful? Of course, you probably don't want it as bright. You want it as dim as possible. What about different colors, like a red light? I know when my children were young, we put a red light there that seemed to make a pretty marked difference compared to a white light.
Yes.
So perhaps you could speak to that?
Yeah, I think low levels of light and night light, if it's comforting for the child, is perfectly fine. And these lights are really low. I mean, the old night lights would produce 1 or 2 lux, which is terribly low, and is enough. It's a good illustration that it's enough to sort of be aware for the visual system to sort of kind of function, but it's not going to have an effect upon the clock.
Melatonin is often used in pediatric clinics. For children. What's your sort of take on that?
There's nothing else. That's the problem. And melatonin has also been used in the case of the blind. So if you have no eyes or no functioning eyes, you've lost those specialized cells within the eye that are regulating the clock, you've lost your eyes, then you're drifting through time constantly. So you're not only visually blind, but you're time blind as well. And so melatonin has been used to try and stabilize the sleep-wake profile. So we don't have anything else. It's been the only drug.
What's your take on the idea that we set the clock through our exposure to light, not just through the eye? Some people say that you can also set it, or there was some talk in the past, I think, from light on the skin and light in other areas. I believe there was one trial that was then not replicated again.
Yes.
What's the latest with that?
Yeah. So,
because some of these myths kind of
they won't
stick
go
around.
away. Yeah, absolutely. So there was a paper published in Science in about, I think it was 1998, suggesting that light behind the knee could be used to set the body clock. And this was published, as I say, in leading journal, peer-reviewed, and it could not be replicated by any other lab. And we don't quite know what happened, but and I don't want to speculate, but basically the experiment was profoundly flawed. So there is currently no way you can set the clock with light exposure outside the eyes.
So in theory, if one could sleep in a room full of lights, but you had an eye mask on that we could measure stopped all light coming into your eyes, in theory, you could have a sound night's sleep.
Well, yeah. I mean, but of course, in theory, we don't have to talk about theory. I mean, if you're given a light-dark cycle and your eyes are covered, you won't entrain to that light-dark cycle. You'll drift through time. So you have to have light exposure via the eye. Now, I'm not saying that there may well be in the future some receptor somewhere.
Sure.
But at the moment, we know that eye loss or covering the eyes means you can't entrain.
I get it. Things may change in the future. And of course, I'm not sure any of us want to wear an eye mask and have a brightly lit room just to try and prove a point. Unless they're in one of your experiments.
But it's been done, yeah.
But it has been done. And therefore, would you say...
But I should say, I mean, I remember when we had a grant into one of the funding bodies, you know, and these are the early days, we were looking for these novel receptors within the eye, these non-rod, non-cone photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. And I remember the grant went down. It was just blitzed. And one of the comments is, why is Foster looking for a novel receptor in the eye when we know it's behind the knee? So I'm not bitter.
Well,
but I was completely shocked, and it's still there. I mean, it's still in some textbooks.
Yeah, and that, I think, you know, we mentioned humility before in this conversation. I think we all need to adopt a bit of humility in terms of what we know and what we might know in the future. Because I remember so well in our first conversation, you basically saying that in 1987, you were at a conference talking about light being one of the main ways to entrain our circadian rhythm, and it was almost laughed off.
Oh, well, because I was saying that it's not the visual system. It's not the rods and cones detecting this light. There's something else in the eye. And as I may have said last time, you know, the comments were, we've been studying the eye for 150 years. Are you seriously telling us, you young pup, that we've missed an entire class of photoreceptor? Of course, I was young, full of vigor. I said, yes, and these are the data. It really does help to be young if you want to say something new.
No, and it's... So we all need a bit of humility about what we may not know yet.
So I think absolutely.
That's important.
Yeah, and how things might change. But, you know, the data's the data. And what we accumulated was 10 years of absolutely, you know, solid data showing it's got to be something else in the eye.
Just to finish off melatonin, there is a concern often being expressed that if you are taking melatonin long term, it will suppress your body's own natural endogenous production. Is that within your expertise? Do you know much about that?
It's not really within my expertise, but I don't think that's likely to be the case. I think it will be additive rather than suppressive. Unlike, you know, most other systems which have a feedback loop and they would turn it off. I think it's because of the way melatonin works, is that it's not secreted. It's released. So the pineal is generating melatonin, and because it's so lipid permeable, it just spreads, you know, into the brain, into the cerebral spinal fluid, and everywhere. So there may well be a feedback loop, but I'm not aware of it, actually.
Okay. Something that often affects people as they get older, it affects their sleep, is the need to pee at night.
Oh, yeah. I'm so often asked about this, yeah.
Yeah, so what are your initial thoughts about that?
Well, there's a couple of things going on here. One is that as we age, the amplitude, the strength, if you like, of the circadian drive becomes diminished. So sleep-wake cycle becomes less robust. It's a bit more wobbly. But that's also true for the release of many hormones which are under circadian regulation.
Can I just pause you there a second, Russell? Do we know that sleep-wake cycle becomes less robust as we get older because that's how we're programmed, or because of what we do? Is it environmental? You know, as we get older, are we going out less? Are we getting less of those environmental inputs?
Yes, and it's a very good point, because, of course, it may well be that because the circadian response to light diminishes as we age, then light that we could normally drive the circadian system earlier in our lives is not as effective. And so if you increase the amount of light, for example, in the nursing home environment, you can increase the stability of the sleep-wake. And what Aus van Summeren showed is that when you do increase the light in a nursing home, you not only improve sleep, but you can improve cognition in those individuals showing mild dementia.
I think that's a really important point, Russell, and one we should just pause on, because whether we have parents in nursing homes or they're living by themselves in the house or whatever it might be, paying attention to light exposure in the day, even if they're not going outside, you're basically saying, put the lights on, get it really bright in the day. That's going to help sleep and cognition.
Yes, absolutely. Well, what's interesting is that architects are getting this. Then they're responding beautifully. Oh. So the people designing modern nursing homes and buildings generally are not relying on artificial light, but is actually as much as possible letting natural light in. Yeah. And in fact, there's an award called the Daylight Award for architects who've actually shown that in their building design, they've enhanced the exposure to natural light.
I love that.
It's brilliant. It's fantastic. And I'm on actually the jury to select these prizes. And so I've learned so much about what architects are doing and how they value light. In fact, there's an architect called Ian Ritchie, and he says the first principle of architecture is natural light. Isn't that brilliant?
I love that. You can almost retire now, go, my work is done, right? That's wonderful, isn't it? Because that actually is such a serious and such an important point. If more and more buildings, work buildings, home buildings, blocks of flats, nursing homes, hospitals, whatever it might be, were designed with natural light at the heart of them, you're probably immediately going to have an improvement in physical health, mental health, cognition, all kinds of things without even having to do anything.
Well, so there's a very interesting set of studies done about 20 years ago.
To make sure you're taking action after watching this video, I've created a free guide to help you build healthy habits. We can all make short-term change, but can those changes become a fundamental part of our life? Often they don't. And that's why in this free guide, I share with you the 6 crucial steps you need to take. They're really, really effective. If you want to get hold of that free guide right now, all you have to do is click the link in the description box below.
Which looked at different schools and measured the amount of light the pupils were being exposed to and then correlated that with grades. And the greater the light in the classroom, the higher the success in terms of grades.
I love that. And then I think about all the research on exposure to nature and what that does to lowering cortisol and our well-being. And you think, well, when you're in nature, you're being exposed to light, right? So it's hard to parse out what's the difference between looking at a tree in a dark place versus in a light park, let's say. But all the data is supporting, it's all kind of saying the same thing. Get outside as much as you can.
Again, yes, light.
Okay, let's go back to peeing at night.
Yes, so, we got deflected there, yes.
As per usual.
So we were talking about the circadian system and that the circadian drive, the amplitude becomes flatter. So that means that the sleep-wake cycle is less robust, it's less strongly driven. But we also said that, of course, if you can increase light exposure, you can sort of kick it in and you can increase the drive. But it's still going to diminish to some extent. And that's also true for the hormones that are under circadian regulation. And the hormones regulating urine production are under circadian regulation. Of course, they're high during the day when we're moving around and we want to pee, and they're low at night when we're asleep and we ideally shouldn't pee. And that difference becomes slightly blurred. So the hormonal drive underlying urine production is not as precise as we age. So we're more likely to want to pee at night. The other thing, of course, if we're on antihypertensives, they can also make you want to pee at night more readily. But another thing that is so fascinating, particularly in elderly individuals who are sedentary, they're sitting in a chair all day, and at the end of the day, you look down, there's puffy ankles, swollen lower limbs. And of course, fluid, blood, has collected in the lower limbs. Now, when you lie flat, that is then reintegrated into the body. That increases blood pressure. The heart detects that increase in blood pressure and triggers the production of urine.
Wow.
And so actually just by lying down after a day of sitting, and you're probably slightly hypertensive, you can generate a litre of urine. So that's why it's so important for the elderly not to sit in day and to move around as much as they possibly can to prevent that sort of settling of fluid in the lower limbs.
Yeah, it's super, super interesting. I think for many years we would often put down, particularly in men, if they were having problems, we would often say, after doing investigations and tests and examinations, that it was down to the prostate getting bigger, something called BPH, benign prostatic hyperplasia, so not cancer, just a benign mechanism.
You can't void as much as you need to.
Yeah, and so the pressure of that would cause that urge. I think you're also saying that the sleep, the depth of sleep might be lower as you're older, so you're going to be aware of that more.
That's right. I mean, you might become sort of conscious, and then you sense that your bladder's full, and then you go and pee. But it's not necessarily the bladder waking you up. It's just that you have lighter sleep, and then you become more aware that you need to pee.
There was a nice paper, I think it was 2018, called Circadian Rhythms in the Kidney. And it was one of the first times I came across this idea that, I knew about circadian clocks and that every organ system is running on its own clock. And that paper, I think, was saying that for the first 10 hours after waking, that kidneys are filtering fluid at a really rapid rate. Then after 10 hours, it goes down dramatically.
Yeah.
And when you think about that, and I was actually chatting about this literally a few days ago, a friend of mine who's, I think, in the mid-50s, he has to get up at 4 a.m. for his work, and he's really struggling with his sleep and getting up multiple times in the night. And he's been to see his doctor. I think all kinds of investigations have been done, but I don't think there's anything that's come up. And I was rereading this paper recently, and so I said to him, hey, listen, you get up at 4 a.m., so that means if we're to believe that your filtration system in your kidneys is working as per this paper on the circadian system, then actually that means by 2 p.m., right, things are starting to shut down.
Yeah.
How much fluid are you drinking after 2 p.m.? Turns out a load of fluids, cups of tea, maybe at the evening meal with his family at about 5:30. He would also go to bed early at 7, half 7, because he had to be up.
Yep.
So I said, listen, you might want to try really being mindful after 2 p.m. He goes, that early? I said, well, look, it's worth a try.
Yes.
I think it's going to make a difference.
I think you're absolutely right.
I think it's going to make a massive difference because of the circadian system, right?
Yeah. And of course, we talked about changes in those hormones underpinning urine production, so vasopressin being one. Now, there are synthetic analogues of vasopressin. Of course, I think it's called desmopressin. Is that right? Yeah. And that can be used to actually reduce nighttime peeing as well, because it's sort of compensating for that drop in amplitude. So, yeah, that's one thought.
Talking about humility, Russell.
Yes.
Do you ever think...
Don't know where this is going.
do you ever think this idea that every organ system in the body is running on its own clock, and we're learning with all this modern science how incredible that is, and how the liver has its own clock, the bladder, the kidneys, all these things have their own clock. To my knowledge, traditional Chinese medicine has been saying this for, 2,000-3,000 years. I find that really fascinating that there was, in that culture, an understanding, a knowing...
Of rhythmicity.
Yes.
Yes.
I don't know, do you ever reflect on that?
Well, yes, I do. And every time I sort of give a sort of a public talk, somebody says, what about Chinese medicine? And people are very sensitive and aware of it. And of course, in the West, we've rather sort of rejected it as, being something a bit weird. But they did get the bigger picture that biology follows a rhythm, and that one needs to think about medicines and one's activities that enhance that rhythm.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
No, it is absolutely fascinating, yeah.
I want to talk about rest for a moment.
Oh, yes.
It's something I've been thinking a lot about recently, rest. And one of the reasons this has come up for me is that you talk a lot about sleep. I talk a lot about sleep. And what I would notice for quite a few years now is that some people who are apparently sleeping well are waking up feeling unrested. And in particular, when I've dived deep here, what I've noticed is a lot of people these days, they are staying stimulated in the 1 hour before bed.
Yeah.
Whether on a device or anything else, right? They're staying stimulated, so they're not winding down. And they say, yeah, I sleep fine, but I wake up feeling exhausted. And I found that with those individuals, when I can help them realize the importance of winding down for an hour, ideally 90 minutes, well, let's say an hour, they're actually having the same amount of sleep, apparently. They're not measuring it or tracking it, but they're waking up feeling refreshed. I don't know if you have any data to support that, or you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, where we have some interesting data is that during the day, if you could go into a state of quiet restfulness, then you actually do benefit. You do feel more restored, and your productivity during the second half of the day can improve. And that's without sleep. That's just with quiet relaxation.
And it helps you sleep at night?
And it helps you sleep at night. So napping is a very interesting issue. So the agreed sort of metric for napping is 20 minutes, ideally no longer than 30 minutes, around the middle of the day, can enhance your ability to function later in the day. And that's going into sleep. Longer than that, it can be counterproductive. And of course, the danger for napping is, of course, if it becomes very long, and it's close to bedtime, because then it'll push back the pressure for sleep, and you'll find it very difficult to get off to sleep. But short naps, fine. And I don't see anything wrong with that on the basis of the data that we know. That quiet relaxation before bed, I think, is really interesting. We know that relaxation will allow you to get to sleep easier. Whether it produces more restful sleep, and what do we mean by restful sleep? And it's essentially restful sleep is regular sleep. I don't know. And whether the structure of the REM, non-REM cycle is influenced in some way, and maybe if you're waking from REM sleep naturally, you will feel more rested, because that's how we naturally wake up. So if you've used that relaxation and it's changed the timing of sleep in some way so that you then ultimately wake up in REM sleep rather than non-REM sleep, you probably will feel more rested. But we don't have any studies.
I've seen it in enough people to know there's something going on.
Yeah.
Sort of my clinical acumen tells me there's something going on here. And I haven't measured it, but I've seen that if you apparently, for the same amount of sleep in the same way, if you relax for an hour before that compared to being stimulated, subjectively at least, people are saying, oh, I feel much more rested. I felt that myself.
Yeah. There's also some really interesting stuff emerging on using sound frequencies to induce slow wave sleep while you're asleep. And
EMDR?
Well, no. Yes. So what you've got is these specific frequencies, and you can increase slow wave sleep, and that has been. There's one or two papers suggesting that your memory formation and problem solving might be enhanced by that, but it's a very tiny effect. Trouble is, it's now commercial companies are now jumping on it, saying, right, you can enhance your sleep, with these sound frequencies. And I don't know how beneficial it will ultimately turn out to be.
I guess it comes down to what we've repeated on many occasions. If you use sound therapy and you're waking up feeling better and you answer those questions and subjectively you have more energy, your relationships are better, your patience is better, great.
Yep.
If it isn't, and it's making you feel more obsessed about measuring all these metrics, it's possibly not.
Yes. I mean, bottom line is anything that relaxes you before you go to sleep is going to be good for sleep. And I unconvinced by mindfulness when it first started, rumbling around 20 years or so ago.
Were you an Oxford neuroscientist with a healthy dose of skepticism about something called mindfulness?
In fact, it's worse than that. You talked about arrogance. And I abjectly apologize because the data are now clear that type of relaxation technique can be very useful for reducing insomnia.
Any time of the day?
Ideally, before you go to sleep, so it's in that sort of few hours running up to sleep. But I think it's anything that de-stresses, relaxes towards the second half of the day is going to be helpful.
And I think just picking up on the point you mentioned a few minutes ago, that lunchtime break, I talk a lot about stress thresholds and that we accumulate micro stress doses throughout the day. I call a micro stress dose a dose of stress, a little dose of stress. In isolation, you can handle just fine. But when they accumulate one after the other, they get you closer and closer to your stress threshold.
Yeah.
And what I find these days is that people, they're just accumulating these micro stress doses continuously. They feel pressure. I'm not going to take my lunch break. I've got too much to do. Yeah. So they're just accumulating. So in the evening, they're just wound up. They're past their threshold. They can't sleep. They need to stay up late to binge watch. But a little lunchtime reset, a 20-minute walk, it can just reduce how much that how much that dosage is, as it were.
Yeah, and connected to that, I think it's very interesting that poor sleep is associated with the reduced ability to multitask. Because what we're having to do is make lots of decisions from a cloud of stuff that we're being exposed to. Yeah. And so good sleep will actually help with teasing out what's needed to be done from the massive information that we're being inputted, and so reduce to some extent that feeling of being overwhelmed during the day.
Weighted blankets, do you know much about them?
Yeah, I did look into this in the book, and because individuals, parents with children with autism, swear by them.
Absolutely.
And they absolutely say they're fantastic. Sadly, the data doesn't support that. And so the studies that I've seen, and when I published Lifetime, the data was that it makes no difference. I've looked it up for other reasons recently, and one of the Royal Colleges, Royal College of Occupational Health, their conclusion also was that weighted blankets have probably little or no effect. So what people like them, they feel more relaxed with them, but it's not having a big impact upon sleep. That's the consensus. I mean, I find that slightly awkward because anything that relaxes you and de-stresses you is probably going to enhance your sleep. So it's teasing. I think it's teasing apart those things.
Let me put this to you. You're a very well-respected scientist, right? So you do studies, you assess what works, what doesn't work, and a host of other things. If we just take weighted blankets for a moment, you and I both know plenty of mothers who say that was game-changing for their child. So in that individual case, it's working. Something's working, right? Yeah. And then could we say, to play devil's advocate, that could we say one of the downsides sometimes to scientific studies which lead to these singular conclusions, and you're the world-respected scientist here, not me, right? So I'd love your perspective on this. Let's say that study had 100 people in it, right? And let's say 20 kids did improve their sleep, but 20 didn't, and 60 you couldn't tell, or whatever it might be. When you're then averaging this out to say, does it work or does it not work, might we sometimes miss out the individuals who do get benefits when we give these broad conclusions?
Were you in my home last night?
I was not, to my knowledge.
Because that is exactly the conversation I was having with our youngest daughter, Victoria, who's in second year of medical school. And I was saying that by taking an average, we're losing the variation. And what I want to see is ideally longitudinal studies where you look at individual responses over time to a particular stimulus. By taking a great and the larger the cohort, often the averaging loses that variation. And I think that's an incredibly important point, because we might be missing those individuals who do respond to that sort of thing by taking an average.
And I wouldn't want any mother listening to this who is finding benefit to stop using it.
No, I completely agree. And if it works,
there's no downside either, right?
No,
Let's look at side effects. There's no downside.
And let's not be rude about placebo, because, placebo has an effect. If it's a placebo effect, well, that's fine. It's working. And I think but you raise a really important point, and something that I find increasingly frustrating is that we take an average and therefore we set that as a standard for everybody, and it's completely wrong. And it goes back to, you must get 8 hours of sleep. Well, that's the average, but it ranges between 6 and 10.5 hours. And so an average can be deeply misleading and very harmful under certain circumstances. It's a guide. It's kind of an indicator, but it shouldn't be used as a metric for everybody.
Russel, you know how much I love your work. You know how much I love your book, Lifetime. It was published 2 years ago. If you were publishing it today, what would you add to it?
Well, I think there's been progress in the past 2 years, almost in every field. And so understanding of fundamental mechanisms, and it's not a mechanisms heavy book. It's more of sort of, consequences. But I'd like to have a bit more mechanisms, because it's turned out to be so fascinating.
It's very well written. And one thing I really enjoy about it is I think you have a certain style as a writer. You bring a lot of historical perspective, a bit of humor that you've touched a bit on in this conversation today. I think that really adds to it. There is the science in there, but there's also some really nice human stories.
Thank you. Well, and I didn't have the courage to do that originally. I mean, I threw in an anecdote, and the Tom Killingbeck, who was my editor at the time, said, "Oh, that's great. Don't be afraid to put that thing." And so it was like a champagne cork going off. I could then add in all these sorts of things I'd love to add in, and people have said that it's very much helped. Just a quip has helped them sort of get through some of the tougher bits of the science. Was there not a bit about the song Yesterday being... Maybe tell the story of Yesterday. Well, I mean, it's incredible. We were talking about, the importance of sleep and actually coming up with novel solutions to complex problems. And, what our grandparents said was sleep on it. And there are loads of anecdotal examples whereby people have slept on an issue. And so Paul McCartney woke with the entire song, as I understand it, of Yesterday formed in his brain. His brain had been ticking over and constructing. I think it's right. The chap that worked out that the benzene molecule is a ring. He had a dream about a snake biting his tail. So he woke up and thought, it's a ring structure. That's how the carbon atoms are organized. And I think we all have had those sorts of anecdotal experiences. Oh gosh, yes, that's what I need to do.
I love it. Yeah.
It's a great illustration.
Our grandparents knew.
Our grandparents, as always, tended to know.
To finish off our conversation, Russell, we've covered so much in our first one and in this one. There's plenty more in the book that we've not spoken about for people who want to dive deeper. Just to finish off, though, the importance of sleep, I would say, has grown significantly in the public sphere over the last 10 years or so.
Yeah.
There's much more awareness now that sleep is really important. Mm-hmm. Are there any downsides to raising awareness of sleep?
Yes, I think there are. I mean, I think if we raise awareness without providing the educational underpinning, we can generate anxiety. And you do have a condition now called sleep anxiety, because people are now bombarded with conflicting advice. The 6 hours, the waking up in the middle of the night, what you should and what you shouldn't do, whether you should wear an app, and all of the other sorts of things. And I think what we must do is embed knowledge about sleep and circadian biology within our curriculum. Let's get our young people understanding the value of sleep and have that voice that's authoritative. And I think that would be really useful. And I've sort of argued that what we need is perhaps the government should sponsor an authoritative website where different questions are addressed about sleep and circadian rhythms, and it's not simply melatonin as a sleep hormone. You know, all these sorts of shorthands which are confusing people. Say, oh, if I take melatonin, I'm going to sleep. Well, no, you're not necessarily.
Yeah. Thank you. And I want to make sure we did cover this in the first conversation. Shift workers, we did a deep dive on that in conversation 1.
Yes.
We recognize that it can't be easy to hear all this if you are a shift worker. Also, we covered young parents who often get really anxious when they hear about some of the consequences of poor sleep. And what we said in the first conversation, what you said was, don't be afraid to ask for help.
Absolutely.
If you're feeling tired, get a friend around whilst you have a nap, recognize that it's hard and don't worry too much.
No, and get that structure in place. I mean, as we've shifted from the extended family to the nuclear family, we've got to reach out to our friends and family to get that additional support. We did not evolve without that support. A mother on her own would never evolve to do that support. So we must, and get rid of the guilt. Yeah.
And final words, Russell, for someone who feels inspired by what they've heard and is thinking, you know what? I've not given sleep enough of a priority. I've heard some new things today. I'm going to go and try and get it sorted in my own life. Yeah. What are your final words of wisdom for them?
Well, I think that it's everybody thinks that sleep is what you get, rather than having any control over it. And so I think understanding that the quality of our sleep defines the quality of our wake, but it's an incredibly dynamic and flexible behavior. We just need to find the ways that work for us and then embrace it. It shouldn't be too difficult.
Yeah.
And so that was the key message in Lifetime, which is that, we have control to a greater extent than we think over our sleep by using simple modifications of behavior.
Russell, you have been doing incredible work all throughout your career. It's helping individuals. It's helping wider society. Thank you for coming back on the show.
Thank you so much. It's been a great privilege.
If you enjoyed that conversation, then I think you are really going to enjoy this one that I picked out especially. How you start each morning can absolutely set the tone for the rest of your day. So in this video, what I want to do is share with you some of the things that have worked really, really well with my patients, and my hope is that they work really well for you too.